Hello everyone, this is Rajesh Sengupta. We are continuing our discussions on the aspect of sustainability and then also its relationship to textile making. So we have already started talking about ecological parameters and sustainability, and I will be discussing this with few examples, and the case studies will come from kalamkari making as well as block printing from Farrukhabad. So kalamkari making being one of my prime areas of research, I will have a lot to share from this area. Now, how do we see that the ecological factors have affected the making of kalamkari textiles over the centuries? We find that at least from the 17th century there are records of typhoons, cyclones and everything, different kinds of droughts, famines and natural disasters on the Coromandel region. And a lot of times these records come from the records of the traders, the travelers, and later on by the colonial officials. And the Coromandel coast, the Southeast Indian coastline, we find that how this coastline had been this very active region in terms of trading activities, and that is the reason we find that the Danish, French, British, and so on, different groups of Western European traders and colonizers have arrived in this region, and of course the Portuguese and the Dutch. So we find that there are different kinds of records which we find from this Coromandel region, and they talk about the environmental aspects of the coastline. So we see that during this time a lot of these droughts, the famines, they also resulted in a lot of loss of livelihood. So we find that a lot of people who were involved in agricultural production, or the people who were in weaving or different aspects of textile making in the regions, they were perhaps made into slaves. And some of the accounts we do find, and we find in the accounts in which we see that how the people who were already employed in the agrarian sectors or in the artisanal sectors, they were made as slaves, and then they were traded with the with the Dutch and Portuguese traders. But at times we also find that the people who lost their work, they were then re-employed in different kind of textile sectors. And it is assumed that even in making this kalamkari textiles, this dyed, painted and printed textiles from the Coromandel region, that also incorporated a lot of people from this different sectors, because when we see the social structure of the weavers, and especially the weavers in southern India, we find that in the Telugu speaking regions, the Padmashalis and the Devangas are some of the prominent weaver groups, and the Padmashalis, we will also find them in Tamil Nadu as well. So if there are particular communities who are assigned to do particular kind of work, and for woodwork, for carpentry, and similar kind of work we can think about with metal as well. So if those kind of communities, we find them to be involved in one particular work, we do not really see that always in kalamkari making. And at a lot of times we find that how the weavers, they very much get involved in the dyeing processes. Some of the people from the weaver community, we also find them in the blockmakers workshops, and then the naitus, we find them to be part of the drawing kalamkaris in the southern town of Srikalahasti, and further south in Tamil Nadu as well. So these are some of the ways in which we find that there are those mass migration that perhaps happened in this textile sectors, and a lot of times this migrations took place because of this natural disasters and these various natural conditions which compelled the people to shift their livelihood options. So this is something we find that had been done quite a bit of times in the Coromandel region. And the image that we have on screen, this is called a pishash, the effects of the land wind, and we see this storm that hits this area where there is this encampment is. And this is from Charles Gould's, of course, the Oriental drawings. And this drawings were made at the decade of 18th century. So this is something we find, that how condition of the storm, which was already recorded in the journals or the chronicles of these colonial officials, they were also visually depicted. And then the visual also gives us the severity of this kind of storms. Now the other thing we also have to remember, that perhaps that the seasonal cycle in the Coromandel region, that also have a huge impact in the textile making. So the seasonal cycle, the way we see that the way it operates in the southeastern coast of India, there are two monsoons. So we have the southwest monsoon, and which is usually the monsoon time in all over India, which comes after the summer. And then we also have a northeast monsoon, and when the monsoon winds return, we find it in the months of November, December, and some of it might extend until part in January. So during this time we find another monsoon season in this particular area. So this is not really there in other parts of the Indian subcontinent, but this is very specific to the southeast part of India and southeast coastline of India. So this is something we find, that how the monsoon and then the seasonal cycle, this the monsoon twice a year, that certainly makes an impact, in which the availability of water is made possible to the people who need the water for textile making. But also at the same time we find that during monsoon certain kind of works cannot be continued. So for example, if we are thinking about dyeing, if we are thinking about printing, and the kind of works which require a lot of sunlight during the monsoon season, perhaps for a month or so we cannot really have access to direct sunlight like that. So clothes cannot be dried properly, and then a lot of times we have seen that the drying and it has a huge impact in the brilliance and vibrance of color. So this is some of the times we see that how the seasonal cycle impacts on the way in which textile making functions. And if we take example of kalamkari, we see this specificity of the seasonal cycle here, with this two sets of monsoons every year. But then in the other parts of the subcontinent we find that the textile making would also have different kind of other conditions, and making is always dependent on this ecological and environmental factors. So this is something we find, that how water, which is extensively used in dyeing and washing, is some in the kalamkari making, is something that is also highly dependent on the monsoon rains. So for example, in this part of the country we have two of the mighty rivers, Godavari and Krishna, and then many tributaries of these rivers. Then in the region that is where Machilipatnam is situated, it is very close to the delta of river Krishna. There we find numerous canals are there. So Machilipatnam, Pedana, Polavaram, these areas in which kalamkari is produced even now. So this canals we find that, I mean, they carry the water from the river and then it flows to the sea. Now during the summer, in the months of March, April, I mean, I'd say that, I mean, April, May, around this time, we find that the river water becomes scarce, and that's because that Krishna river does not carry water from the glaciers or like the ones we see in the Himalayas. So they are not considered as perennial rivers. So they are primarily rain-fed rivers, and during the months of during the months of the summer, we see that the rivers do not have any much water in them. So since like during this time there is not much water in the rivers, so the water is not really released in the nearby canals, and so during the months of the summer we find that the canals are dried up and one cannot really do any washing or cleaning of these textiles, which is an essential step in kalamkari making. So only after the rains resume, then we find after a point in time the water is then released in the canals, and from this canals, for example in the workshop of late master Dyer Mukanti Ishwara Durao, they have a pond which is adjacent to a canal which flows through the agricultural field, and the canal water is then used in this pond to fill up this pond, and then the pond water is used for the entire year. So this is something we find that how the weather condition, the seasonal cycle, all of them, they are all big contributors to the textile making. Now in this image what we see, and this image is taken in the month of January, in late January, we find that in this image there is this canal in the Pedana, in this hamlet called Pedana, near Machilipatnam, where the washers are involved in washing kalamkari printed textiles. So this printed textiles, they are in various stages. Some of the textiles are only printed with black and mordant, and some of them already have black developed in them, but then they are being prepared for the successive stages. So in this case what happens, we see that two poles are put in two sides of the canal water, and we can see that here in the image as well, and then a rope is tied between these two poles, and then the fabrics are sort of like let sort of pass through this rope, so that they sort of remain suspended in the water, and this is how these fabrics are left in the water for at least 20 to 25 minutes. At times the washers, they also sort of like change the position of the fabrics, so that if the mordant or excessive dye, they sort of get out of the fabric, they should not really remain at the same place. So there needs to be a bit of movement in the water as well. So the canal water is not really, it does not have a high current, but then it is useful for keeping the fabric suspended and slowly washing away the mordants from it, mordant and excessive dyes from it. So these are the reasons why we find that the availability of water in these canals are very important for making kalamkari. Now why they cannot really wash these things in the sea water? For obvious reason, and that would be the concentration of salt, but also at the same time in the sea we cannot really have an arrangement that is there in a canal. And in the image it is also very well seen that how the kind of water bodies we talk about in this particular practice, in which we see that the water is usually waist deep, or maybe it comes until the chest, but not more than that. So we do not talk about the water that is really deep, but it has to be in a condition that is not too deep, not too shallow. So this is something in which we find that this kind of conditions exist very well in the canals, or in the summers the washers and the dyers, they take these fabrics to certain pockets in the riverbed, and perhaps in the riverbeds like Krishna and Godavari, we do not really see the entire riverbed would be flooded with water, but certain pockets would have more water than like the other streams. So in those areas they would do the similar kind of washing practice, where one can submerge themselves until the waist or chest, and then like this washing practice can continue. So this kind of conditions, we find that all these conditions are enabled because of the seasonal cycle, and that is the reason thinking about the impact of season, thinking about the impact of ecology becomes very important in a production of textile like this. Then we also find that water, it also has its impact on the oral and visual culture, and water's impact on the oral culture we have already discussed in the earlier part of this course, and when we spoke about kalamkari making. But we see that, I mean, if we consider that also in terms of how we think about ecological sustainability, so the ways in which some of the popular sayings have evolved, for example, how water make the people think differently, and that means that, I mean, there is a different impact of the water in the lives of the people, that had already come up in the discussion with Dyer Nageshwara Rao in the workshop of late Master Dyer Mukanteshwara Rao during one of my conversations in 2015. So we find that how those kind of sayings, the local sayings, are also full of information about the quality of water and how it has this transformative quality to impact the textile production in this region. So this is also something for us to think about, how the oral culture, and then that has also evolved with very close connection with the ecology of this region. So keeping ecological sustainability is also to think about that, I mean, how ecology has not only just made its impact on the ways in which textiles are produced, but also the way people think that, I mean, this textile making has made an impact on their ability to think. And that's because that if we see that the particular kind of composition of the water that changes, then it makes the artisans think about an alternative process to fix this entire chain of operations, to achieve particular or desired color or dyes in this process. So we find that, I mean, water is not just a material for or resources for continuing certain kind of work, but it also gives ample amount of opportunity for the dyers, for the artisans to think through this. So as we have spoken about this idea of holistic sustainability, in which it is not just about supporting the livelihood but also about mental and physical well-being. So thinking here about the impact of water in someone's thinking ability is also something that goes back to this idea of holistic sustainability. Now we also see that how water had made its impact on the visual culture of this region, and this is a blog that we have from this region which is called Nachu, and Nachu or seaweed is this this block in which we find this complex almost intersecting patterns of the seaweed in the wood block. I mean, of course, it's a stylized version of seaweed, but then the character of the seaweed, which is suspended in the water, is something that is portrayed very well in the way in which the blocks are executed. So this again, it's a reminder for us to think how this blocks can be something of a visual reminder of how the ecological knowledge was absorbed by the artisans, and then that was also implemented in the visual that we have as an outcome of this process. Now we can also think that there are many other different kinds of textile making practices. For example, in coastal Andhra we also find that there are particular kind of weaving practices, and one of them would be Tarangini weave, which is also made in and around this Machilipatnam Polavaram area. This areas are agriculturally rich, and there are many weaving communities in this region. So we find this Tarangini weave is also something in which we see that the gradation of the stripes which are there in the finely woven cotton, they also resemble the waves of the water, the waves in terms of how there is gradation, there is also ups and downs. So those ideas are and then the rhythm of the waves, they are all communicated through this abstracted stripes in the weaves. So this is something we find that how the ecology plays a big role, not only in terms of how we manage these resources or achieve particular kind of color, but also in our abilities to think, in our abilities to communicate certain kind of ideas. So the ability to think would be something to do with a much more representational way, that is there in this Nachu blocks, in which we see that the seaweeds is sort of represented in a slightly stylized format, and then the ways in which they are suspended in the water is communicated through this swirling lines. But then the idea of Tarangini sari, in which we see the stripes, they come to represent the rhythmic flow of the waves, and then the gradation and the ups and downs. So they also show that how this idea of ecology is much more abstracted in the way in which they are visually represented in these weaves. The other aspect would be in terms of thinking about what happened in the city of Farrukhabad in Uttar Pradesh, and this is also around some 140 kilometers from the city of Kanpur, where I am situated in. And here what we find that the for centuries there have been flourishing textile making practices, and mostly block printed textile making practices that have existed here. And in the 19th century we find that the textiles which were produced in Farrukhabad and Fatehgarh is right adjacent to Farrukhabad. So this textiles which were produced here, the block printed textiles, they were collected by Forbes Watson, and they are also represented in his album, the Textile Manufacturers of India, in the late 19th century. However, what we find that in the 1980s, in the 1990s, the amount of chemical dyes which were used by the dyeing units in Farrukhabad, and Farrukhabad being situated right beside the river Ganges, we find that with this environmental concerns, a lot of these dyeing units were closed off. And from that time, what we find that the printing activities in Farrukhabad had also been very limited. Now with that, we see that there is this migration of block makers. So in Farrukhabad, in and around Farrukhabad, there is this tradition of training wood block makers, and that is the reason we also find that the engraving tools, the iron engraving tools which are used in block making, they are also extensively produced in Farrukhabad. So Farrukhabad and in and around this region in UP, in western UP. So we see that, I mean, the block makers were present, but then with the loss of their jobs, a lot of block makers, they started migrating. So some of the block makers landed in Jaipur, and Jaipur being this thriving hub of tourism, textiles and other craft practices, we find that a lot of artisans, they have relocated to Jaipur. And then there are also artisans from Farrukhabad, they are there in Gujarat. And then in my recent trips in the last 3-4 years in Machilipatnam, in Pedana, I have also found that at least 4 to 5 members in the workshop of Gangadhar Kondra and Narsaiah Kondra, they are from Uttar Pradesh, and majority of them are from Farrukhabad. So this is something we find that what happens when there are particular kind of ecological concern, and how that also affects the livelihood of the artisans as well as the mass migration of artisans from one place to another. So if we think about that what happened in the past in the Coromandel region, that how the famine, the drought and all those different natural conditions, they have forced people to move from one occupation to another, and also thinking in terms of how uh, that had also fueled the production of kalamkari making in the coastal region. So we see here that how the loss of livelihood in Farrukhabad, that had resulted in the mass migration of artisans in and out of this region, and also like flourishing of the centers in other places. So this is something we find in Farrukhabad. However, at the same time, there are also modes to revive this tradition there, and one of the revival project here we see that that is supported by the government of India, and that is taken up by the Gautam Buddha Development Society, and the office and the primary unit of it is situated in the Farrukhabad city, but then Farrukhabad town, but then the unit, which is this common facility center that we have in the right side of the screen, this unit is then sort of made outside the city in the middle of this agricultural land, where we see that there is ample amount of sunlight, also that there is place to dry fabrics, and then the water and all the other resources are there. So this is something we find that how the new endeavors, they are sort of trying to revert certain kind of situations that the city or the town had encountered in the past, and perhaps this is also something we can see as a way forward to think about that what can happen, and how different kind of things can also have its impact. Now the idea we find that perhaps here is would also be relevant is the idea of social sustainability. So social sustainability is something we find that is more than thinking about just the environmental factors and then the livelihood options, but it is also about the reciprocity between people, between communities, and then building a trust between people. So reciprocity, trust, a kind of commitment, all those things that kind of exist between individuals as well as members within a community and between communities is something that we can understand as social sustainability. The interconnectedness between people, interconnectedness between communities is something that we can also understand as a way of social sustainability. So interconnections for exchanging knowledge, exchanging skill is something that we can understand as this way of this reciprocal correlation between people. And of course that trust remains as a very important aspect of social sustainability. So when we see that the idea of interdependence of communities are there, so the interdependence that comes only based on the idea of trust, and here what we see that there are different ways in which this is perhaps pursued or conveyed. So one of the examples would certainly be the ways in which we see the agrarian communities and the textile makers in around the area of Polavaram and Machilipatnam are there. So for example, we find that for making dyed textiles, this already woven fabrics are collected, they are procured, and then they reach the dyer's workshop. But then in the stages of dyeing, it requires extensive amount of boiling, and then the boiling that comes from of course that from the local rice husk. So rice husk is something that is collected from the nearby fields, the agricultural fields, and then this is something we find that when the rice husk is used in this purpose, after that then the burnt rice husk are then sent back to the agricultural field, and that is used as fertilizers. So here we see that the fertilizers are something that is used here in terms of understanding how the agrarian communities and the textile maker communities are interconnected. So if this trust or the reciprocity is not there between them, this kind of practice cannot really survive or flourish. The same thing can be said something about the tools which are used in kalamkari making, the block making, that is called kalam. And in the left side of the slide we have an image of that, this engraving tool which is used for carving wood blocks. Then similar kind of tools we also find that is used in other kind of engraving. For example, for making bidri, this bidri is a specialized metal craft that has flourished in the Deccan region, and in and around in Bidar, in Hyderabad and other parts of the Deccan plateau, we find that bidri making had flourished for centuries. Now presently we find bidri is there in Bidar and Hyderabad. Now, this also sort of like, I mean, we see that this similar kind of engraving tools are used for making these metalwares, which are also called column. Now, this shows that there is a reciprocity between the block makers and the metalware makers, and that is the reason we find that there is a shared notion of a skill, and then the similar kind of engraving tools are also shared between them. So this is something we see as a way of reciprocity, and then how social sustainability can result into flourishing of both these communities, and not really claiming one thing to be an exclusive knowledge base for one particular community, but how we see that, I mean, this is a way of simultaneous blossoming of the knowledge and skill and livelihood of people in all these sectors. So this is how we can understand these different aspects of sustainability. We will continue the discussion on cultural sustainability and the impact of them in the design education, and our responsibility as educators in the field of sustainability in the next lecture. Thank you.